We thank you for your input. Our elders will be praying for you.
The tithing buckets are in the back. Have a good day, sir.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Nat Turney, and with me, as always, is my brother, John. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
Did you have to get like that close to the mic to do that? Is that your deal now? You gotta reach it and go.
It's my deal.
Okay. How's it going, man? That's how you get that sort of Barry White thing going in your voice. Like, yes, welcome to This Is Not Church.
After dark.
All silliness aside. Actually, I don't even know why I say that. There's no all silliness aside. This is all silliness all the time. But
yes,
we're pleased to introduce our next guest. And just let me tell you a little bit about him. And we're just going to jump right into a conversation. So our guest today is Kevin Sweeney. Kevin Sweeney is co-founder and lead pastor of Emergent Church, an urban church in Honolulu. Everybody saying, "Aw, bummer."
Yes.
I mean, poor guy. Suffering for Jesus in Honolulu that is welcoming of all people. They see imagination as the key to the future. They choose authenticity over performance, substance over hype, and quality over quantity. He is the host of the podcast, The Church Needs Therapy. Amen to that.
Yeah.
And is the author of multiple forthcoming books. The Making of a Mystic. I saw, well, there's more than one, right?
Yeah.
Is that not multiple? No,
that is multiple.
Don't split hairs with me, you jackass. I ain't got time for your crap, man. It's already been a long day. Okay, a couple of books. The Making of a Mystic, My Journey with Mushrooms, My Life as a Pastor, and Why It's Okay for Everyone to Relax. It's a really long title. I like it. Out on May 31st. And The Joy of Letting Go, which will be out in January 2023. Both of these are coming out on Quoir Publishing, our most favoritist publishing house in the world. He lives in Honolulu with his wife and co-founder of Imagine, Christine, and their two kids, True and Mikayla. Welcome to the podcast. Kevin Sweeney, what's up, man?
Yeah, man. I appreciate you guys having me on. And I've been saying this to people as a first-time author for any podcast, and for you guys right now to not know me, not see me on a bunch of other podcasts yet, but to have me on is just something I'm so grateful for. So I appreciate you guys taking the time, man. It's all these conversations are important steps for the book. And I feel like important steps for my life as a whole, because I'm in a transitional phase of my life. So super grateful to be on. Appreciate you guys. They both have great beards. I have leftover scratch from not shaving. I'm like, should I just shave my neck today or actually shave my face? And now this is what I'm left with.
I feel for a guy, hanging out in Hawaii, who's, you won't be able to see the video, but who's young and good looking. You had to have one strike against you, man. And if the worst of your problems is you can't grow a full on like Gandalf beard, I think you're still doing well, brother.
No, you'll see there'll be some more strikes if the video was really clear, because with the amount of sun I've been in for 20 years surfing at my age, I'm like, oh man, here we go. It's coming. My wife's Asian, her family's from Vietnam. So I'm like, babe, when we're 30, we look similar, but as we approach 40, you still look the same. And now I'm just aging so much. So for her,
she's going to get worse, dude. When she's 70, she's still going to look fantastic.
And I'm like, sorry for this, whatever this is. At one point in our lives, we were like similar, and now we're not. Okay.
That's the way it is, though. I have, my wife and I've been married for almost 31 years, and John's almost been married the same amount of time.
Yep.
It'll be 31 this year's for you too, right?
Yeah,
31
July.
this year's. Man, I'm already killing it. So John and I got married within a couple months of each other. And, but I look at pictures of my wife now and pictures of like when we met in high school. And I'm like, how is it possible that you looked very, very similar to when I first met you? And I look like this. Like, what the hell happened? There's no justice in the world. It's just not good. But all of that being said, let's do this. Our typical approach. Actually, before we do that, let me say this too. As grateful as you are for us to have you on, John and I are still in that phase of the podcast when we're so grateful when people say yes to come on the podcast. So, I mean, I hope that never changes.
Really.
I hope we don't ever get like super entitled, be like, at this point, there's nothing to feel entitled about. We're always just really grateful that people will take the time to come on our podcast, which is nothing, we're not exactly killing it. You know what? Yeah, we are killing it, John. But anyway,
Yeah, we are. We are. Let's pat ourselves on the back for a minute. For the short amount of time that we've been doing this, we're doing damn well. I'm happy with where we are.
Don't hurt yourself patting yourself on the back, but it's pretty good.
I can't reach back there anymore.
But what we typically do just to kind of kick things off is because we, at the risk of overusing the word deconstruction, I still think it's appropriate, So I that's really what a lot of this podcast focuses on, is just it's getting people in to talk about their perspectives and maybe the way that they see church and the way they see faith differently. So we like to kind of get started with just your personal story, how things have shifted for you over the years, and maybe what some of those catalysts might have been that prompted some of those rethinkings and changes.
That's a good and I think very, very important question, right now especially. And what's interesting, and obviously you'll get a part of the story in the book, but, I have this existential crisis at 17. I'm asking all kinds of questions. I take this radical inward journey. I'm confronting all my illusions in life. Mushrooms become this unexpected spiritual guide for me. I have this spontaneous awakening moment with God while I was on mushrooms that completely rewired my consciousness and changed the trajectory of my life. So my life with God began very uniquely, I've discovered over the years. It was my foundational experience of faith was direct, immediate experience of the sacred. There was no belief systems. There was no atonement theories. There was no altar calls. It was just an actual knowing of, and which is actually a more being known by the Spirit, which is expressing itself as love, grace, universal affirmation, acceptance. So that's where I began. And then I ended up at a Bible college 3 years later, maybe or so, as time went on. And it was really fascinating to go from here's this wide open experience I have in this like wide open field with not clearly delineated lines. It was just direct knowing. And then I go to a Christian college and they're like, but here is how it actually works. And here's the structure and here's the system and here's what you're supposed to believe. And that was really helpful for me. And I'm super grateful for it. But it didn't take me too long to be there to recognize the limitations of whatever system they were offering me. So, it was classic. It was a Foursquare school, great people. Foursquare is a Pentecostal denomination for people who don't know.
Oh yeah. John and I are intimately familiar with Foursquare.
Yes. Started by a very powerful and a very unique woman in the 20s in LA, which in and of itself is amazing at that time for a woman to do that in that culture. What a disruptor and what a powerful force to do that. And that's a great story.
Oh yeah.
And I remember, I think it was the end of my second year. So when we talk about what is your first big paradigm shift, right? When are there cracks in the surface for you? Because if I zoom out for a sec, deconstruction from my perspective as it's used today, if you think about it from developmental standpoints, I'm like, that's just moving from one stage of consciousness to another.
Exactly. Yeah.
If you look at James Fowler's work, pastorally, it's moving from stage 3 to 4 and hopefully 5. And if you look at spiral dynamics, you're moving from blue to orange and then probably getting a vision of green along the way. So when you zoom out, it's actually, deconstruction, which feels so overwhelming, and I understand why it is. It's actually just a movement from one stage to another, and there will be more movements in the future, but it's the first big one that happens. That's why it can be so, why it feels so big. And at the end of my second year of Bible college, someone told me, they're like, hey, you should really be careful how you talk around here. And I was like, what do you mean? I'm new to this. This is my first time around this many Christians, in my life.
Bible college, not the CIA. It's going to be all right.
And I was like, what are you talking about? And they said, well, if you keep on talking like this, people are going to think you're emergent.
Oh, not emergent, which was the big taboo. Yeah, but I remember that.
Yeah. Which, again, zooming out, I'm like, the emerging church, however many years ago, 15, 20 years ago, when it was really going, that was what's happening now on a collective level was just happening on a fringe level at that point. Because It's the same stage of evolution from my perspective. It's just now, it used to be so far on the edges of the culture, and now it's getting closer to the center. It's just happening on a wider level. And I was like, whoa, I don't know what that is, but I better learn. And so I read Tony Jones' The New Christians. And then that summer is when I discovered how much I can read. And I was reading a book every couple of days, every 2 to 3 days. I never read like that before. And that summer, I'm reading Tony Jones, Doug Padgett, Brian McLaren, then I'm following the footnotes. And I'm like, I came back the next year like a different person. I was like, whatever you were concerned about, you actually gave me the catalyst to push me way beyond wherever you thought you were scared I was going to end up. And so that was my first, was like, okay, it's like when the Dalai Lama says, it's good to learn the rules so you know how to creatively break them. That's what Bible college was for me. It's like, oh, this is the rules. This is a system. This is life on the settlement. This is how things are in this box. And I get that. And now that gave me a foundation to like really build, expand, grow, and evolve from on a theological sense. So I just kept going, and it's been a long time, and I've probably ended up in places and read things they would have never wanted me to. And I'm like, that's okay, because I feel like what I'm doing is a natural evolution and continuing on of what you were teaching me here. Right. I'm not betraying this. I'm just moving forward and growing, And
that's the thing, though. Bible colleges in general. Were you at Fuller? Is that or
after? Yeah. Okay, I went to Fuller after that school.
I was actually on staff in a Foursquare church twice. So, as far as denominations go, don't dislike them more or less than anybody else. Good folks.
I don't know.
Well, you might, if besides my story, like. Personally, when people are talking about deconstruction, like I'm in such a different place because that initial paradigm shift, like I'm sure for many other people, for me happened so long ago, but I still understand it and hopefully empathize and get the struggle of it and why it feels overwhelming. So the thing I would say to people who are really in the middle of that, I would say a couple things. One, your growth is going to offend people. Your freedom is going to scare people, and your change is going to challenge people.
Yeah, 100%.
And that's okay. Yeah, and that's okay to do that. There will be relational disruption as a result, but that's okay. And even if I think, change is never about betraying where you've been. It's always about becoming who you are.
Yeah.
And that's a really important thing. We can feel this sense of guilt, shame, or weirdness or uncomfortability with growing because we feel like we're betraying something or we're not being faithful to where we were. But people helped hopefully give you some kind of a foundation, and you're just growing and evolving. And what to you looks like a widening path of inclusion, to other people looks like you're going off of a narrow course. And that's okay. Not everybody's going to understand and not go with you on that journey. But if you're sensing a greater sense of freedom, a greater capacity for love, a greater personal sense to be present to people without manipulating them, then those all feel like really good things and the kind of fruit the Spirit creates in us when we're continuing our journey. So, yeah,
I agree. I mean, that's so much of and I write about this in the book that I'm trying to get published, so I can talk about it. But one of the biggest casualties, I think, that sort of evangelical Christianity has foisted upon people is an inability to trust that intuition, because we've been told not to trust our hearts. We've been told that, they pull out that one verse, that our hearts are desperately wicked and deceitful above all things, which is not how the Septuagint puts it, but okay. And so that's one of the biggest casualties, is we get to a place where we no longer trust our own sense of what feels good and what feels right. And one of the things that I noticed, that my deconstruction started with the grace movement hardcore. And I noticed that as I read and as I started to embrace this sort of radical view of grace, there was just this weight that lifted. And with each successive piece of toxic theology that I just jettisoned, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm breathing a little easier. And you're exactly right. The result of that was a widening of my ability to love, a widening of the circle of people that I would love. And all of a sudden I'm like, well, there's just no way that that's bad. And if I can't trust my intuition, which I would equate with the Holy Spirit, talking to me and giving me senses about what's good and bad, right and wrong, then I'm dependent upon somebody else, some other external force to tell me what's good and bad, right and wrong. Yeah. I don't trust those people to not have agendas. 100%, they always seem to have their own reasons for doing what they do. So I don't know about you. We can talk about this for a second, but that thing, that buzzword of inclusion, I think people latched onto it very quickly, and then they got called on what it meant. Does that make sense? Like they were saying they were inclusive, but they were only They were only opening up their circle a little bit. I got stretched to not just embrace, people who didn't necessarily agree with everything I said, but next thing you know, you're talking about the LGBTQ community. You're talking about what does real inclusion look like? I went to a church and was part of a church for a very long time that considered themselves to be inclusive. But it only went so far, We weren't, nobody in that church was going to be openly hateful to anybody who was gay, but neither were they going to serve on the worship team, be a part of a ministry team, teach Sunday school. There was a limit to what that looked like. So I'm not sure where your church is at on that spectrum as far as inclusion goes or affirmation but has that been kind of your experience as well a little bit?
Even when you talk about this, our church has had a significant presence of LGBTQ people, for an extremely long time. For us, that hasn't been a conversation that we've had to fight and combat. It's just assumed in the atmosphere of hey, there's gay people here and they're with their partners and they can lead, and their life here is essentially has been the same as anyone else's, and the fruit of that is there's a lot of things pastorally I'm not good at. Organizational leadership, all types of stuff. I think one of the things I did well early on in the life of Imagine was knowing the culture we create, the environment we create the first 2 years determines what we can grow in 7 years. And I had a vision for that, and I knew that. And that's why I knew we couldn't start Imagine with a bunch of Christians. Because if you create a community with culturally bound Christians who have been used to doing things a particular way, whether they're conscious of it or not, then they're going to unconsciously but inevitably reinforce, recreate, and perpetuate that same culture and same systems, which for me is a culture that's getting in the way of a lot of what I believe the Spirit's trying to invite us into. And early on, I knew that to create the kind of inclusive environment of the future, inclusive in a really broad sense of the term, we had to be super intentional in the beginning. And I also knew personally, I'm I can't spend my life arguing with Christians and trying to get religious people to be a little more loving or open or inclusive. I was just that's not my energy. I'm not going to spend my Monday mornings responding to emails because of my sermon. Yeah. I don't care. I don't give a shit. I'm just not, and we embraced that from the beginning at Imagine, where I'm what we're here doing is creating the new. We're not fighting the old. Of course I have my critiques. Of course I can have these conversations, and I'm going to own all of that. But my primary energy is not an oppositional energy. It's not an antagonistic energy towards what was. It is a life-giving, creative, and hopeful energy towards what we hope this will be. And the culture of something will naturally weed out people who are uncomfortable with it. So if someone who was much more conservative evangelical came to check out Imagine, it wouldn't be long until they would be no. Because the environment is foreign to them. The language is foreign to them. It's a different cultural experience, and it's one they're uncomfortable with. And I was not trying to keep those people around. I'm yeah, cool. It doesn't work for you. I believe your presence would be counterproductive here for a lot of people anyways, who are looking for safe spaces and have nowhere else to go. And I was always very open and fine with that. I was I'm not trying to win those people. I'm not trying to get other Christians to be here. This isn't for you. This is for people who have nowhere else to go. And even when you were talking about growth and people only going so far, I remember some kid in Bible college, he said something basically, I want to be able to read at a broader level when at that point for them, progressive was NT, right? He said this is talking about new creation.
Yeah. I remember those days. He was friends.
Basically, it's new creation means no rapture. Whoa, this is insane, right? For kids who have been in that. But he's but pretty much I still want to stay the same. So he's I want to read people, but I still in the end want to control where I end up. And I'm that is not intellectual honesty. And that is not honesty when it comes to real curiosity in a spiritual sense. Real intellectual integrity and spiritual honesty and desire is, I'm going to pursue truth as far as it goes. And I'm going to allow the chips of thinking to fall wherever they fall. That's not my point, is to control it. My point is to be honest, to let go of anything that's hindering my ability to embrace however truth is revealing herself to us along the way. And I think that's something that's defined my journey all the time, is like not being scared. And because I didn't have that religious and cultural baggage and weight that was like, you can't do this. I never had that. You know what I'm saying? Like, my first experience of God was like, I know what just happened. I know what just happened, and I'm going to rechange my entire life because of it. So that deep internal knowing with, and sometimes as the Spirit, seeing with my own eyes, like that was how my relationship began. You know, so I think that sort of greased up the wheels of evolution for me, because I need to let go of that belief. That's fine. I was never overly attached to that. That wasn't the whole thing in the first place. The whole thing was this direct knowing. So
yeah, but there's so much of that stuff that, you know, so many of those sort of, I'm going to say foundational, but they're not. You know what I mean? The ones that are given to us that we're told are foundational. I've talked about this. I pastor a small church here in Texas, and I say all the time, we talk about stuff like this. And I'm like, listen, all these things that I'm challenging, they're not foundational. These were things that the early church didn't give a shit about. And somehow we've turned them into these, you know, major pillars of faith, you know? And so I start knocking these things out. The structure doesn't fall, man. You knock out the rapture. I'm fine with that. Let it go. What was it adding to your life but fear and trepidation anyway? It was all just smoke and mirrors. You know, you start talking about atonement theories. Atonement theories were never the gospel anyway. So let's be honest, none of us know how this really goes down. We don't understand the mechanics of the cross. Let's not get bogged down on one. So I've been slowly chipping away at those, not for any need to be destructive, quite the opposite. I think those things that build themselves up and that eventually take the place of Jesus anyway, right? There's a whole lot of people out there involved and passionate about church who are involved in stuff that I think Christ would just roll his eyes at me. Like, seriously, this is what we're spending our time with? I mean, there are people hungry, need food, need clothes, need love, and you're out there fighting about penal substitution. Stop. But John and I grew up more traditionally, you know, and I came up through ministry more traditionally, you know, so being an associate pastor, being a worship, you know, I mean, sort of working your way up, as it were, through the ranks to eventually become a senior pastor and do all these things. And I'll tell you what you said early on.
You made it, dude. You were the kid. You grew up in the system and you made it to the top, baby. You did it.
Blew the system apart. And how I am by every objective standard, I'm a failure as a pastor by all of the standards that I was given. If I was to evaluate my church based on what my colleagues and people who they would look at me and go, man, you got to get a consultant in there because you are, this isn't working. And I'm like, no, it's perfect. I like it just the way it is, man. But there was that thing you said at the beginning, was that your growth will make people uncomfortable. And the way, you know, they are only comfortable as long as you stay, like you can go to the edges of the boxes they built for you.
Exactly.
And then you're edgy, right? And I was always the guy who was just, man, you're always, and he's always just, but I always sort of stayed inside the box, even if it was close to the edges of that. And I was tolerated. And the second that I stepped outside those boxes or dared to even challenge the existence of the box, man, there was hell to pay for that. And I still have to this day, relationships that never have recovered from all of those, because they, you know, again, it's not about me. It's about their discomfort with me, which I think challenges their own certainties and challenges their own sense of security in their own system. They don't want people coming along and bucking the system that they still need to be real and they still need to be whole.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's,
well, I think, and to me, that's one of the really fascinating things about Jesus, because I do believe there were times where it seemed like Jesus consciously and creatively subverted boundaries to make these amazing points. And other times, I think the real radical nature of what Jesus was doing was not a conscious subverting of a particular religious boundary they had. It was the complete non-acknowledgement of them as this force of love. So Jesus wasn't edgy. He wasn't paying attention to edges. Jesus wasn't he was acting as if the boundaries that existed for you didn't exist in the first place. So he's subverting all these things. It's like, because his love is naturally flowing in this world and it looks looks edgy and boundary breaking, but to him, this is just the natural expression of how love looks. And I think that complete disregard and non-paying attention to the boundaries is why so much of his life is why we're still fascinated and why it's still shattering paradigms and boundaries today, because it was so far beyond, because it wasn't, hey, I'm 10 yards beyond that boundary. It was like,
what boundary?
What he discovers, love dismantles all of the boundaries that separate us, including the ones you believe were set in place by God. And you discover along the way they weren't. They were internalized boundaries that family systems, culture, all that stuff, right? Church, religious teachings, they're boundaries that have been dismantled. And those are, as we're deconstructing, evolving, and growing, those are the moments it feels like I'm betraying God, but it's actually God who is the one inviting me forward. And we do have to learn to trust that. You cross over a boundary and you're like, oh, like my heart's pounding. Can I really just be friends with this person? Like, this is something that's really edgy, or can I really say this? Can I really read this? And you start to get a little anxious. You know, I've had those moments like reading and just growing before. And you're like, but I just sense that it's love and the Spirit itself that's inviting me to what feels like beyond what I used to think were the edges of God, but really were just the boundaries of the people around me and what they thought.
Yeah, no, amen to that. I agree.
Yeah, I agree with you. As not my deconstruction are different and then similar at the same time. So I left the church a long time ago. I left the church when I was like 18 years old, and then did just a kind of, I guess, wandered the wilderness or whatever you want to call it. But I was so entrenched in that system that even though I didn't believe in it anymore, I still felt this like need to be obedient when it came to what I would speak about, what I would put out into the world. So as I'm reaching and searching and trying to find the piece that I thought was missing in me, right, which was some kind of faith or spirituality, and I reached out and I started reading people like the Dalai Lama, became very, very intrigued by the Buddhist faith. I wouldn't really talk about it because I didn't want to offend the few Christians who still considered me friends. But you're right. You get to a point where you're like, if this love is real and what God is calling us to do, he or she or they or it or whatever you want to call it, the universe or whatever, and we are reaching out to other people outside of this little box that we have created ourselves in, we have to see their paths and their wandering as another connection to the divine. So then you start seeing and you start talking to people within, say, the Muslim faith, or you say within the Buddhist faith, or whichever, right? All these areas where you were told these people are just horrible, they're going to hell, they've completely lost their way. And then you start listening to them and you realize that their paths are about love and togetherness and connection. If you just stop and listen and compare how you guys are all on very similar paths.
Well, the great Buddhist Thich Nhat Hanh, who passed away recently, said to be a good Christian means that you're going to be a good Buddhist, and if you're a good Buddhist, that basically means you're a good Christian too.
One of the first things that really stuck with me was that I think it was C.S. Lewis that said it, which I don't really know exactly where he was coming from when he said this, but he says that a Buddhist at any given moment is a better Christian than the person sitting in the pew next to you. And I understand what he's saying. There's a lot of C.S. Lewis that I have thrown out. What I think he's trying to get at, and trying to be kind of edgy in his way as well, is saying that just because you sit in a pew and you listen to a pastor who proclaims to be a Christian doesn't mean that you're walking the path of love. I think that's where he's getting at. But I think we need to even break those boundaries. We need to stop. We need to say, okay, why does it have to be Christian Buddhist? Why can't it be Muslim Buddhist? Why can't it be Buddhist Buddhist? Why does it have to always be something we compare everything to a bad Christian because we're so damn loud.
Well, no, that's the moment where then Nat would grab your mic at the church and be like, all right, your 5 minutes is up. And then he goes on.
We thank you for your input. Our elders will be praying for you.
The girls, the tithing buckets are in the back. Have a good day, sir.
See yourself out. I got in trouble at the church I used to work at for quoting people. Here's what cracked me up. I got in trouble one time for posting something on Facebook, and nobody argued with the quote. It was perfectly fine. They just didn't like the guy who originated the quote. I'm like, oh, so you have an issue with the person. How do you feel about the words he spoke? And I don't know if you know who Morgan Guyton is, but he's I'm probably saying his name wrong, Morgan Guyton, Guyton. But he had just put up this really pithy saying, and it was like, it says something like, it's ironic, because I find it ironic, and I'm probably missed this a little bit, but that we put in God we trust on the God in which we really trust. I'm like, ooh, that is ironic. That's interesting. So I put that out there. I'm like, oh, 150, 200 people. Oh, like. And then somebody was like, oh, that Morgan Guyton, he's a liberal. I was like, oh no, perish the thought. I can't.
Therefore, we are to hate him.
Right. Yeah. And I've never called my dad out on this podcast before, but I'll call him out a little bit because, one of my favorite people in the world was Eugene Peterson. I just loved him, and somebody had given him a Eugene Peterson book to read. And I think it was A Long Obedience in the Same Direction, and, which is a phenomenal book. And Dad put it down because, I think really early on in the book, maybe even in the first chapter, he quoted Nietzsche. I was like, well, I'm done. They're quoting Nietzsche. I'm like, Dad, did you read the rest of the book? He's like, I know all I need to know. He quoted Nietzsche. I'm like, okay,
Dad, if you think that's bad, the guy I'm interviewing for the podcast thinks he met God through mushrooms.
Right. No,
there's a good segue.
In my dad's defense, he helps financially sponsor this podcast, so he's a good dude. You know what I'm saying?
Nice.
We have multiple places of disagreement, but he's never wavered in his support of his sons. So
that's
for
awesome.
that, Dad, if you ever listen to this, I love you. You're the man. But it is interesting, though, that we get that. That's one of those places, though, I think, where those boxes come into play, right? Where I was going to say, I like what your friend at Bible school said. Better to say, I find it really interesting that somebody would say, I want to read more. I want to broaden my scope of reading, but I don't want it to change me. Then what's the point?
Right.
Like, what's the point? Why would I put hours and hours into reading? Even if it's just to sometimes, I've read Calvin's Institutes. I think Calvin's a nut job. All right. I believe with, I pretty much agree with David Bentley Hart. He got most everything wrong. All right. But so I sometimes I read things just because I want to know. It helps me grow to know what I don't agree with. So that's, early on in my life, I started reading books by atheists for the same reason. Then I found out more places of agreement than disagreement. I was like, son of a bitch. It's like, all right.
Those were back. No, if he was honest, those are back in the apologetics days. So he was just sharpening his sword to know how to come at him.
and actually, that's what originally that's what it was. Everything we did. Do you remember this from? You're not old enough, probably, but anyway, when John and I were kids, and we were sort of being groomed by youth pastors to go into ministry and to be evangelists. Everything had an agenda. You didn't do anything out of the pure intention of So even something as simple as making a friend was always, they called that like friendship evangelism. And I'm like, so I'm supposed to befriend somebody outside of my circle, which I think is healthy and great and good, except that. The backwards, the unspoken intention was, now I'll parlay that friendship into an invitation to church. I can parlay that friendship into trying to win them for Christ. I'm like, man, what a underhanded kind of shitty thing to do. Why won't you just befriend somebody and then see where that relationship goes? Are you guys
familiar with Peter Rollins?
Oh yeah, I love Peter Rollins, man.
Okay, so
if you know him, get us in touch. We've been trying really hard. Shameless in my pursuit of Peter Rollins.
You know how people they'll say we have a thing where if we know a band or an artist early on, we're like, dude, I was listening to them way before anybody knew them, right?
I used to see them in the club before anyone knew who the hell they were. Yeah.
And I feel like Peter Rollins, I have that with him where I'm like, bro, I've been reading Peter Rollins before, whatever. And I think I went to, because he would do a couple speaking tour type, things. And I think I went to the first one he ever did, and it was the beginning of 2009, I think. So I was living in Orange County at the time, and he did this speaking thing at this small Seventh-day Adventist church in Hollywood. It was a purple church. This guy Ryan Bell used to lead, and his event there was called Beyond Evangelism.
Nice.
And the idea of most evangelism, I'm sort of reading into it, but most evangelism is experienced as vandalism by other people. And he told a story. He used this story it was this movie with Kevin Spacey and I think Danny DeVito. It's called like Big Fish or something. They're like salesmen.
Yeah, I
like
remember Big Fish.
Yeah. They're like petroleum salesmen.
Yeah, I have heard him talk about that.
And he told this story of like one of the salesmen is like a young, highly evangelical kid, like very zealous or whatever. And he's supposed to go and have this big meeting, which I think will maybe make or break the company. And so Kevin Spacey and Danny DeVito are like anxious, like, pacing, waiting for the kid to come back from the big meeting he got. And the kid comes back and they're like, so what'd you talk about? Like, and the kid's like, Christ. and Kevin Spacey just like goes off on him. I think maybe tries to attack him, and he finally leaves. And then there was a good moment there where Danny DeVito's character is giving him this whole speech in a more compassionate way, but he said, anytime you put your hands on the wheel of a conversation and try to steer it in a specific direction, you're no longer a human being, you're a salesman. And that's what Rollins was working with at the time. So the friendship evangelism stuff, I just think about how many Christian kids out there have been so highly anxious in everyday social settings because of the pressure they feel to steer the environment towards a conversation about the quote unquote gospel, which limits their ability to just be present, to be people both in a loving way and in a way that's enjoyable for themselves. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's always, I remember that. That was my man, I went to Peter Rollins' first speaking tour. Did you know about how not to speak of God when I was 24 or whatever?
That's so good, man.
But his work, his
work is great. His pyrotheology stuff is really good. I bought tickets and was going to Belfast to participate in his C.S. Lewis thing that he does there. He's done it a couple times and got into a really bad car wreck and ended up not being able to go. But did meet him a few years ago when he was on tour with Rob Bell. And so he would come out and didn't speak nearly long enough. But, then Rob Bell comes and does Rob Bell's thing. First thing I noticed about Peter is he's much shorter than Rob. Rob's very tall. Very, very tall, by the way. But the other thing about Peter is that, and I'll call him Pete. Can I call you Pete? If you don't want me to call you Pete, call me. And let's talk about it. I'm desperately trying to get a hold of him. I'd love to have him on the show. But
no, come on the podcast and explain to me why you don't want me to call you Pete.
Petey, if I can call you that.
Wow.
I can listen to that dude read the phone book, man. I love his accent so much. And I know he probably gets it all the time, but he's got that, oh my gosh, that Irish brogue is just, but there's sometimes when I'm listening to him, like I have to go back and go, okay, what did you just say? Because, but one of those things that what got me started with Peter Rollins was listening to him on Rob Bell's podcast years ago. And he did a 3 or 4 part segment with Rob. And he did this whole thing where he's talking about, God does not exist. God is existence itself. He started, he's the one who actually introduced me to Derrida, who if you're into deconstruction and you don't know the name, Derrida, then that he's the guy who coined the phrase, and he meant it for another purpose entirely. But he talks about Jacques Derrida talking about what it means to give a perfect gift. And it was really fascinating. He's like, I'm not sure if you've heard this, but it's like, so he's like, how do you give the best kind of gift you could give would be a gift that you give anonymously. But even that gift, still benefits you somehow. Like you still walk away from that gift going, oh, I did a good thing. There's an acknowledgement there. And so he sort of walks through this process of the only perfect gift is to give a gift that you didn't want to give and that the person who got it never knows they received. And for him, that was forgiveness. Just give it, but you don't have to go announce it to people. They'll never know they got it. You didn't really want to give it. That's as close to a perfect gift as you can give. And have you had this experience? I'll throw this out to you though, where somebody has come up to you, and I had a guy once, I guess I offended him. I don't know, I was blissfully unaware he was pissed at me until he had to find me at church one day and have a long conversation about how he forgave me. And I'm like, wow, thank you. You know, you could have just forgiven me and let it go. And you and I was never even aware you were mad. And that sort of got that thing thinking for me, like, okay, could you not have just let that go? And never, but I don't know. Have you had that experience where somebody has to make a show of either asking for your forgiveness or giving you forgiveness? And
I don't, as a pastor for almost a decade, and you definitely hear some interesting things. I have really interesting things said too, and I'm using that term "interesting" as a very broad term. Yes, it's very value neutral and covers essentially anything that can be said. But thankfully, I don't think there's too much of. I've had some moments of forgiveness that have been really good and meaningful. So I don't think I've had anybody like, you get after 3 years, you get a text message and someone's like, I forgive you with no explanation. You're like, okay, that wasn't helpful. You're like, and now my ego gets slightly offended. Now you have to wonder what that was. And now I'm left thinking about it. Do I need to hit you up? Can I just let it go? So it's like in the future, just don't do
maybe
that.
just keep that stuff to yourself. But no, I don't know. I was fascinated with Peter, and I still am. So again, my last call, Peter, if you're listening, give us a shout. But yeah, we've got great stuff. So when you talk about the Emergent Church, that was kind of the place where I first started to get into trouble with the church that I was on staff at the time, because I started listening to Rob Bell, who was part of that for a little while. Started reading Brian McLaren, Phyllis Tickle, and that Emergent brand had been put upon. I'm not even sure that was something that internally they called themselves. I think initially it was kind of like a lot of things, a bit of a pejorative. There's this Emergent Church, these sort of post-Christian whatever guys, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that's actually, I'm seeing that continue. I think Brian McLaren's still very much an active voice in whatever's happening on the fringes of our faith. I don't think the Emergent Church ever went away. I think it has evolved, because those voices are still very much out there. Yeah,
I think it's honestly from then until now where people are at now talking about deconstruction. I mean, I genuinely believe it's the same movement from stages of faith, but I do think a big difference in what it feels like now or what it sounds like to people and why it's different is back then it was the same movement in stages of consciousness, but it was more like philosophical and theological was the focus. And now it's that, but it's also much more, we're talking about decolonizing. We're talking about institutionalized white supremacy. We're talking about Eurocentricity. I don't know, people probably don't use that term as much, but people are focusing a lot about that. So to me, it's the same broad movement of growing in our faith and growing in our consciousness. It's just then there wasn't as much emphasis on institutionalized race, on decolonizing. McLaren was talking about that a long time ago, but it was like not the main thing. By the time he got to a new kind of Christianity in 2010, he was like, that was becoming more there. So, but to me, it's the same stage of growth. There's just different elements people are focusing on, because I just think the broader collective consciousness is waking up more and more to like I had a joke about that in 2020. I'm like, systemic racism is the term of the year, for people. But it's the reality of it clearly isn't new. But a lot of people had never thought about race or thought about evil or thought about whatever on systemic and institutional levels. So, and I think that's extremely important and it's helpful, and it needs to be. That is a conversation that even like when we started talking about mushrooms, like I have a chapter in the book called Mushrooms and Missionaries. And I talk about how, mushrooms were essentially a missionary for me. And when I tell people that, I'm like, hey, let's just take a moment to suspend our urgent need to talk about why the term missionary is completely entangled in Eurocentric, white supremacist, colonizing, expanding empire, a movement, because it is, because then I go on to say like, well, at the core, at essence, a missionary is good in the sense of they're pointing people further towards Christ, towards truth, towards the source. That's great. But that word is triggering on so many levels because it's bound up within such so much forms of institutionalized, systemic, like we said, white supremacy, Eurocentricity, domination, violence, empire building, etc. So,
yeah.
Yep.
I went on, I think I've told this before. I went on one missions trip when I was a kid. I was already I was at a place where I was already questioning my faith. I was already questioning Christianity as a whole. And we went on this missions trip to Jamaica. It was like 88, 89. It was right after a really bad hurricane had gone through. And so I think we did it under some guise that we were going to go help because the summer camp had been kind of devastated by this hurricane. And we're there, and the people were amazing. First of all, the people were beautiful and awesome and happy. And I was blown away by how welcoming they were to us. One evening, okay, so the summer camp was split, right? And there was the women's side or the girls' side and the boys' side. So I wasn't privy to this till the next day, but apparently there was this just kind of overwhelming moment of just joy and faith, and it was just being kind of brought about by song and dance. And the youth leaders that we were there with shut it down because it felt too voodoo. It felt too Jamaican, Rastafarian, whatever you want to call it. And I was offended. I was like, you have basically told them that what they feel inside, the faith that they're building isn't valid because it doesn't fit into your box. And that was one of the last nails in the coffin for me. I was like, okay, I just can't do this. This is just so ridiculously stupid. But I want to talk a little bit more about that journey of yours and using mushrooms to connect with God. It's a pretty clunky segue, but it's a segue nonetheless. Because it interests me. You're not the first person we've talked to who has used some kind of psychedelic or whatever you want to call it to open their connection to the divine. And so it sounds like you did this at a fairly young age. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but from a statement you said earlier.
Yeah, I started the first time I ate mushrooms, I was 16. And the last time I did, I was 18. And, I tell a story in that chapter, Mushrooms and Missionaries, where, the great mystic, the great 20th century mystic, Thomas Merton, early in his journey of awakening, there was a visiting Hindu monk in the U.S. named Mahanam Brata Brahmachari. And I think he was lecturing at Yale Divinity or those types of schools or something. And somehow Merton gets a hold of him or probably stops him somewhere or does something. And, Merton probably asks him for guidance. What should I be reading? It's like when you're waiting, you go to a conference, you're like, now's my time to talk to him. Wait, no, Peter Rollins is talking to somebody else. Wait, his back turns, go. Oh man, someone else is there. And so, Merton asks him for guidance. And what's fascinating is this great Hindu monk and this man of wisdom, he didn't point a young Thomas Merton to his own scriptures or his own tradition or his own writers. He told Merton to read Confessions by St. Augustine and Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, which, let's say he reads those get somehow integrated into his journey and he becomes one of the greatest, from my perspective, Christian mystics ever. Well, that's interesting because if we think about a missionary, considering what I said earlier, but at their best is someone pointing you further towards Christ. Well, in that sense, that Hindu monk was an unexpected missionary pointing Thomas Merton further towards the fullness of life in Christ. I bet that wasn't in his job description or a mission statement coming to the U.S. at that time, but we could say it happened. And I tell that story because in the same way that Hindu monk was a missionary pointing Merton towards Christ, mushrooms became this missionary pointing me further towards the fullness of life in Christ as well. And, when I started eating mushrooms at 16, I wasn't thinking, I'm going to eat these so they can become companions on a spiritual journey towards whatever truth is. No, I was like, no, I'm 16 and we do drugs and this isn't what I'm going to do. It was like, and I've done other drugs and, I'm getting high every day at that point in my life and doing whatever. It's like, no, I'm just going to eat mushrooms and trip out. But what eventually they started to become more for me because of the profound experience I was having. And eventually I sensed this deep thing in the mushrooms where they were saying to me, yes, but keep going. Like that was what I felt was happening. It was like they were a signpost pointing me to a future I couldn't see. It was like they were pointing me to the freedom I desired but wasn't sure existed. And they were pointing me to a truth I hoped for but knew wasn't guaranteed. You know, it was almost like each time I would do it, they would bless me with just enough of a taste of the possibilities of freedom to keep going ahead toward what felt like a promise of a different future. So they kept, it was like I would get a glimpse of the goal. I would get a taste of what could be. And I also knew even at that age, the freedom I long for that I experience while I'm on these has to become present in my life without taking them, because this freedom can't be contingent upon me taking them, because then I'm not really free. I'm looking for the peace and the joy and the freedom that comes every single day, that these are showing me as possible. I just don't know how to get there yet. I don't know what it's calling me into. So that, and then there's another chapter in the book called More Mushrooms and the Most Important Moment of My Life, which is when I had a really bad, scary trip on mushrooms. I'm like, I think I might die. Get me to a hospital, strap me to a bed, and get me under professional medical watch. Thankfully, I didn't do that. And I went to my girlfriend's house at the time, who's now my wife, which is hilarious to know we have that history together of that long. And, you know, the full story's in the book, but that night, once my wife and my girlfriend at the time fell asleep, my friend was with me and he kind of just zoned out. But in that night, I laid there and had this almost physical, I could feel light and love and life being infused and enveloping my entire being. And it was the beginning point of my life with God was a universal affirmation of my very existence. It was an unconditional love infinitely pouring itself out through me and in me in the moment. You know, it was this giant yes towards who I was, this life beyond this ego we're naturally over-identified with, into this larger self with a capital S of, oh, this is who I really am. You know, like when Thomas Merton says, pride makes me artificial, but humility makes me real. It was the complete muting of my ego and my over-identification with it in the moment, and this falling into this larger sense of love that then completely relativized and changed my relationship with my ego sense of self after that. Completely changed my entire life. So, and even at that point, I never did mushrooms or other hard drugs, but I never did psychedelics again after that experience, because I was like, these were the signs pointing me beyond themselves to the source itself, the source being God, spirit, love. My friend still jokes around with me about being a pastor and a Christian, and me referring to God as that which is. So he's like, oh, Kev, don't even pray to Jesus. He prays to that which is, you know, or we joke, or I've said to like somebody before, helped to start the church. Like my friend was like, yeah, Kev don't even baptize people in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. He baptizes them in the name of welcome, acceptance, and grace. I'm like, that works too with me. I really don't care. But even at 18, I had this profound sense of, oh, those were the signs pointing me. They were the directions to the ocean being reality and God and life and all that. And once I'm in the ocean, the point is no longer to return to the directions. The point is to continue to live my life in the ocean and eventually wake up as the ocean itself. And I felt to go back to the signs, because let's say 6 months later, I'm like, dude, I want to eat mushrooms again. Why? Because they're freaking awesome. And I trip out and you feel great, you know, or whatever. But I thought to myself, to go back to the signs would be a form of betrayal to the truth of the spirit that got me here, or that they eventually pointed me to. And I'm like, no, the point is not to go back with a guaranteed ecstatic or euphoric experience. What I've been searching for is the truth beyond that. And the point of my life is to develop the practices or to go on a path that actually allows me to become this for the rest of my life. And that's honestly, like my life, that is the fork in the road, the cosmic for me, like turning point for my life forever was like that moment.
Now I got to go score some mushrooms, John. I'm sure you know what guys.
For me, that's normal.
They are not that easy to score in Texas. Well,
John looks like the dude that probably my friend bought him from when we were kids.
Yeah, John's probably got something growing on his property up there in the mountains. He's a regular hillbilly, this guy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do find it interesting because, Nat and I growing up in Humboldt County, it's not that hard for people to know what the drug of choice in our county was. Most people know, it's not I don't think it's as important a place as it was back in the 70s, 60s, 70s as like, okay, that's where we come. I mean, that same trip when I was in Jamaica, I was on some beach at some point and this guy comes up and asked me if I wanted to buy some weed from him. And I said, dude, I'm from Humboldt County. He's like, do you have any?
As a matter of fact.
But I do find it interesting because, I partook quite a bit when we were younger, Nat and I. And I did have one of those moments where, I'd been smoking weed pretty much all day somewhere in the forest. And I did have that moment where everything seemed to connect. And I couldn't tell you why. But I saw nature as part of God and God as part of nature and love as part of God and God as part of love and all this stuff. And it's in this trippy moment where you're not really sure if you're hearing the right thing, but you're definitely opening up to a more broader sense of what God is and what reality is or what reality isn't. And, but it's funny that you bring up a point where you had a bad experience. Was that question real quick? Was that like the last time you took mushrooms?
Yeah. The bad experience where like, I think I might die. That was the same experience of like this awakening moment with God. It was the same trip. Yeah.
Yeah. So years later, I'm in my house and I'm just having some weed with my cousin. And, it is like the worst trip I've ever had. And, he never admitted it, but I know it was late. I know it was laced and that was why it was so bad. But, and it was at that moment where I'm like, okay, I need to like reevaluate what I'm doing. Right. And so that was the last time I did, but they were years apart.
Yeah. Even with that experience or, and this isn't obvious to everybody, but there is this reemergence of, the interest and the intrigue in psychedelics for their therapeutic purposes, dealing with trauma. There's all kinds of stuff. Right. And I am pretty ambivalent towards the reemergence of psychedelics. I have my thoughts on, of course, like here's the fruit it's producing, which to me, you can't really deny, but also as a person who grows up doing drugs, you're like, in the end, most people just want to get high, so I'm kind of leaving it open because it depends on how people relate to things. But regardless of the genuine people I know who are involved in that movement and other people who I'm just like, yeah, they're more interested in like just going to Coachella right now because it's this weekend and tripping out. I'm like, the real work of transformation and the further journey toward freedom does not happen during the psychedelic trip. It always happens after. That is a peak experience. That is a glimpse. That is a mountaintop moment, just like going to a Christian camp as a kid, hands raised, tears coming down, on fire for Jesus. The real work is not how high or how emotionally charged or how much of a real authentic experience you had of God in that moment. The real work is translating that into a path afterwards. And that's the same, I believe, for psychedelics and for those types of things. Like Alan Watts, who's, one of the saints for folks who are probably interested in that movement or are growing and looking for spirituality outside of the church. He says psychedelic experience is only a glimpse of genuine mystical insight. And he has that famous phrase where he's like, once you get the message, hang up the phone. Because he's like, when you get the message, hang up the phone, because for psychedelic drugs are simply instruments like microscopes, telescopes, and telephones. And to me, I'm like, that is a helpful way of looking at it because the experience, the vision you got has to be transformed into the values of who you are. That peak experience needs to become the path that you're on. And, when Ken Wilber talks about meditation, he says, the temporary states you experience, like talking about meditation, our temporary states need to become permanent traits. So that which you experience in a temporary, it could be in a worship experience, it could be on a Zen retreat, it could be in anything, from my perspective, you could have a genuine experience anywhere, but those need to be translated into permanent traits, into who you are outside of that actual ecstatic experience. And for me, afterwards, it's, well, do you have a practice that sustains this connection after 5, 7, 10 years? Are you doing the shadow work of overcoming your own neurosis or whatever it is? Are you facing your illusions? Are you overcoming wounds? Are you letting go? Are you practicing acceptance? Because those are the things that are going to define whether a spiritual experience actually translates into a spiritual life. So for me, that's why I didn't go. For me, at that point, I'm like, to go back to psychedelics would be to go backwards, because they were pointing me beyond themselves.
And that was one of the places that I began to diverge with church, was because that was what we were always trying to do, was create those experiences. And then if we created them once or twice successfully, then we were always trying to recreate them.
Exactly.
And it was like, so every sudden, so for years and years and years, 99% of the church's resources and emphasis and energy was placed on Sunday morning so that we could create an experience whereby people could experience what we thought they should experience. And then it was just like, I kept telling people, it was like chasing a high.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're always trying to get to that, hey, remember that first hit of crack? It was so good, man. Can we just have it like that again?
Exactly.
And the answer is no.
Yeah.
No, you can't. So I was a youth pastor for a little while, and I had enough wisdom as a youth pastor to tell my kids, hey, we're going to go to camp and it's going to be great and you're going to love it. And you're probably going to have a couple of, pretty significant experiences here. What you'll do with it when you come home is what's important. How you allow that to change you and transform you is what's important. Don't expect us to come back from church and then be able to recreate that atmosphere.
Exactly.
It's not possible. It's not tenable. But, that became a place of discomfort for me, though, seeing the energy that was placed, the amount of resources that were poured into it, simply trying to create a moment, when you're in Hawaii. And when I was on staff at a church in California, my pastor there was really enamored of Wayne Cordero. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you're in Hawaii, you know Wayne.
Mm-hmm. His son
anyway.
Married my wife and I like almost 15 years ago. Yeah, I'm still friends with his son and his wife, Uwe, and my wife are like really close friends. Yes, I know him.
So we traveled to Hawaii on the church's dime, by the way, which was great. This is how you arrive when you're, hey, we're going to a conference, kid. I'm taking you someplace. And we hop on a plane, we go to Hawaii for a week, and spend 4 or 5 days with Wayne Cordero, because at the time, our thinking was Wayne's doing something different. He's marshaling resources in a much more responsible way. I'm not sure how much you know about Wayne, and I bet you our theology is far worlds apart. But what I did respect about him was how much work he did with volunteers, how much of his church is run by not by staffed, well-paid personnel, but by people on the ground, boots on the ground. And that was something that we were trying to replicate. Like, okay, how can we do something on a larger scale without having to just constantly be tapping our people on the shoulder? Because he was working, his original church plant was in a fairly poor part of Honolulu. Remember, they took over a high school.
Yeah,
Farrington. They didn't take it over, but they was it Farmington?
Farrington, yeah.
Was it Farrington? Farrington, right. Farrington. So Farrington High has a, fairly old at the time, decrepit auditorium, and Wayne comes in and pours a bunch of money into it. The school benefited greatly benefits from him being there. But anyway, it was an interesting thing. But there was still that sense of that production value. You know what I'm saying? Wayne puts on a heck of a show. Church being more of a production value. And that was, for me, that started to bristle for me. It started to kind of be a place of divergence with me and sort of more traditional church.
Well, I think that is what happens when you have that kind of a high, whether it's at Burning Man or at a Coachella, or you go to your Christian versions of that, or you go to a New Age retreat and you're like, they said I could spend $500 and overcome my ego in a weekend. Let's do it. You're like, that's not really how that works. I think they may have finesse.
You have to have a big ego when you're broke. We just keep taking your money. So
even I remember being at a big church this is when I first really started going to church, the first couple of years or 3 years or something. And it was a very large church in Los Angeles, just some service. And was one of those ones where like, oh my gosh, like 400 people are down at the altar call. Like this is mind blowing to my 21-year-old mind. And then I'm like, then the next week I'm like, oh wait, it's the same 400 people, you know, who went last week.
Yeah.
But
this is funny though. I'll tell you when I was, this is how pervasive this problem is though. It's not, it happens everywhere, right? The very first church I was legitimately on staff at, we had code words. So we'd give the altar call, every eye closed, every head bowed, and the pastor would say certain things to acknowledge people if they were, so that the people doing the count in the back knew if they were frequent flyers or not.
Frequent flyers?
Like, I see that hand. Yeah, we call them frequent flyers because they got saved every week.
Wow.
So, okay, I see that hand. I see that hand. Yes, yes. I see that hand. And if anytime you said yes, yes, okay, those are frequent flyers. You don't count them.
Daryl, that's just,
so at least he was honest enough to.
Daryl, that's just John. That was just John again. He came back from the forest of Humboldt trying to come back to Jesus, and he just leaves right after.
No, we grew up in a culture where that was actually pretty encouraged. You know, the rededication, I was trying how many times I got saved.
So I remember at 20 or 21 or probably 21-ish, I go down to the front. So I must have responded because I'm up there. And the pastor was basically, I don't even know what he's saying, but he's definitely, doing his thing. And then he's like, does anyone here have anxiety? Right. And like people raise their hands or something like that. And then he's like, something like in the name of Jesus or whatever, your anxiety is gone. And I remember being 21 thinking that's very irresponsible or something like that.
Yeah, like, right.
What happens to this vulnerable young person next to me who so badly wants to believe that? And then they go home and they're feeling great. And then 3 days later, their anxiety's back. It's going to be confusing because an authority figure just said in the name of Jesus or however you frame that. And now what are they going to think? Is it my fault? Do I not have enough faith or whatever the atmosphere communicates? And that is an example of the real work does not happen on the mountaintop. It's when we return and actually learn to integrate this. Like, it's not about what you believe. It's whether or not you're becoming these things on your path. How do you take, like what Ken Wilber says, that temporary, what I would like, or I could say that temporary space, how does it become your permanent face? And that's always, again, that's the non-sexy, non-thing of like, hey, you want to learn how to, when I talk about disidentifying with your ego, when I talk about disidentifying with your thoughts, when I talk about uncoiling and relaxing and settling into this larger sense of spirit that transcends your own ego, an individual sense of self. Well, if you practice silence, let's say 20 minutes a day, 4 days a week, in 5 years, you'll start to get it. Like no one wants that, no one wants to do that. No one wants to be like, hey, like I have a chapter in the book called Religion and Reality. I'm like how religion can be a way of us avoiding reality, especially for leaders, I'm like, maybe right now you don't need to read your Bible more. Maybe you just need to get a therapist. Maybe you don't need to go to another deliverance night, and you need to have two friends who you trust hold some serious space with you as you practice being vulnerable and honest about what you're really going through for the first time. Because you can eventually go manufacturing the next high in God experience can actually become an unconscious way of avoiding the real work you need to do, because you think it's magically going to help you overcome the real work when in the end, no, there's probably some real forgiveness, some real acceptance you have to practice, some real letting go you need to do, like the things your ego avoids at all costs. Because we think if we just manufacture a big enough of a God experience, we can short circuit that and overcome it and basically not go in and through the real work, but go around it. And I'm like, not to say you never have an authentic experience in those spaces, but if you keep returning to them over and over, eventually I think they're the things that you think are liberating you and leading you along the way are actually getting in the way of what the Spirit's inviting you into. And perhaps we don't need $100,000 sound system to get you to the next moment in your life. And actually what you need is some silence and some honesty and some real vulnerability or whatever. So people want the mushroom trip, they want the deliverance night, they want the big Christian conference, but when it comes to the real work, that's an entirely different journey that happens in quiet, real spaces of our life.
Yeah. And perhaps, when I believe it was Karl Marx who called religion the opiate of the masses, maybe he wasn't far off the mark, because that
Probably
really
not.
is, those religious structures do become, just a way of avoiding reality. Like you said, I think that's a perfect way to put it. I go back to the movie The Matrix over and over and over because, that original Matrix movie was so mind blowing, and I saw all these parallels, and that's what I call religion anymore. Anyway, it's the religious matrix. It's the truth that's been pulled down over your eyes to blind you from the truth, so that you can be a productive member of this little organization, all the while, killing yourself. And really, if we're being honest, what a lot of churches are doing, and again, when I say the church, I mean the institutional, church writ large, but they're using their members, they're getting them, they're either feeding their own ego, or they're filling their own coffers, or they're doing something to keep them inside the fold. And I've experienced this firsthand, where they will, when they start to sense that you're slipping from their grasp, they break out all kinds of strange tactics to try and keep you inside the fold.
There was I don't know if you've seen this, it's just on my Instagram or announcing stuff, but we're actually in the last chapter of Imagine Our Church. So we announced in January that we're actually closing it down.
Oh, wow.
After almost a decade or whatever. Yeah. So that's a whole different conversation. So,
but at the end, you bring it up. Nice job.
Well, and, when my second book's coming out, obviously I'm going to reach out and force my way in here again somehow.
Yeah. We'd be insulted if you didn't. But so is this something that you planned from the beginning to like it would have a certain lifespan, or is circumstances just kind of?
I think the different points of convergence that led to this is, one, coming into Imagine. I had this sense from the beginning, I'm going to do this for about 10 years.
Yeah.
I didn't see I'm going to be a lead pastor or whatever my role, or, that person for 30 years. That wasn't my vision. And I don't have that. There's so much, like I said, of that particular role where it is it's organizational leadership. It's delegating, it's empowering, it's communication, it's all that responsibility. I'm like, you got the wrong person for this. Honestly, I'm 6 years into this, Googling 5 minutes, what do you do in a meeting? This is not where my good strengths are. And I'm 10 minutes before the meeting, I'm trying to create excuses to get out of the meeting when I'm the one responsible for running the meeting.
Yeah, but that's me every Sunday thinking, man, if I could just get out of preaching this week, that'd be great. Maybe it's time to hang it up.
And I think I had that sense. And then, loss, struggle, all that stuff of the pandemic, which I'm sure, Nat, you've experienced in your own way, just the struggle of doing that, where we tried to reopen up in the fall after 18 months or so of not meeting. And what my wife and I thought might be a 2 to 3 year chapter of rebuilding, we discovered after 4 to 6 weeks, no, this is the last chapter, and it's a lot shorter than we thought, and it's not a rebuilding. And my mind started to shift my relationship with the church from rebuilding or being born again to no, this feels like it's moving towards hospice care, which is a really important metaphor, because the nature of how you relate to a living being when you're fighting for their life is very different from when you're coming to terms with where it's at. And now it's not prolonging. It's not the duration of time. It's being present and quality of time. And we made that shift, and it's honestly been a great one. We just invited hey, in the church, we're going to do this last 6-month journey, intentional time of back at our place. Cause we have a big space on the 7th floor here, a public area of it's going to be small. It's going to be drinks, going to be food sometimes. And it's going to be just all I have left is the energy to be present with people. I can't do anything else where I was at. And so, that the depths of that is much more. But what I was going to say when you talked about churches using people, there was multiple times in the church where I could look at a young person, say a young guy who's in his 20s, and be like, this is the kind of hardworking and or charismatic person who would get promoted in a lot of church cultures very quickly. Good with people, give them this. They're willing, you can get them to do all these things. And I looked at them and it was whatever my specific thoughts were, the sentiment was, I could do that with them right now, and it would benefit my agenda as a pastor. It would benefit the church because of how much they're giving, and it would really work against this person's life as a whole for their future. Because if they keep being promoted because they're charismatic, because they're hard workers, when I know there's some shadow issues they really need to work out, when I know there's some real healing and transformation they need to do, what's good for me will actually hurt them in the long run. And actually will probably hurt other people, because if they're put in positions later on, they're going to hurt people because of their shadow issues and because of what they haven't processed. Or I cannot really, quote unquote, put them to work and just say, hey, I think essentially just allow them to be present and just go on their own journey with Christ of healing, as opposed to putting them to work. And I can feel those energies as a pastor the last 10 years. I'm like, oh, this is what would happen in that kind of environment. You're the person who's like, I'm going to take you to the conference. I'm going to do this with you. I'm going to put you in front of people. I'm going to do this. And to me, I'm like, that would be irresponsible and dangerous. And I'm actually just going to surrender. Yes, this would benefit us or make my life easier. And this person actually needs this for their own future. But it's real, man. That people feel the pressure. They want things to happen where people can get consumed very easily in particular cultures that are like that. Yeah.
It becomes predatory, really, to the point where, my wife and I,
That's so scary.
It is.
For me, Matt, it's again, not growing. I didn't know anything about evangelical culture in high school. I didn't know it existed. I never knew there was youth groups or anything. No one ever invited me to a youth group, probably because they're like, oh, he's the one who eats mushrooms. He's not going to come. So there's good reason why they didn't invite me.
Right.
But I didn't learn till later. So my experience of what you just said is more of a distant, I understand it, but I don't have a personal connection and experience with it. So I don't have as much of an emotional charge. And also I don't take for granted or just assume that's how it's done. So when you say predatory, I'm like, that sounds so extreme, but it's so true. And it's so scary. Well, and it's so dangerous.
The scary thing about it was, that wasn't, it wasn't accidentally predatory. I mean, we had conversations about how to pursue these people, So when you spot someone who you think is this, I'll tell you that, within the churches that I was on staff, decisions about where to place people and how to best utilize their gifts, which is, euphemism for how to use them, were largely based on, like you just said, some of the criteria you mentioned. It was charisma, and they're hardworking and they're compliant and they're willing to go along. But it also then the more nefarious places, it also was, well, who are they connected to? And by me pulling this person in, who do I pull in with them? So they're connected to this family, and this family, oh man, they'd be big donors if we got them pulled in. So even as a youth pastor, there were times it was like, man, if you get the kids, you get the parents. So it was, but I saw those things blow up. Exactly what you said was where there were people who were on the surface, had their stuff together. They were very charismatic. They were all these things. And there was so much shadow work that had never been done. There were so many issues lying below the surface, that those things almost always inevitably went bad. And when they went bad, they went really bad. I could tell you about some scandals we had in our churches that were borderline tabloid worthy.
And see, when I hear that, with where I'm at now, I'm in a transitional, moving into post, congregational, meaning without my role in the church, for the first time in a decade or so. And I look at both of you and I'm like, one, Nat, I have so much respect for people who are clergy, who are still leading and still wanting to create more faithful, more hopeful expressions of the faith. That's what I was doing. That's what I've been doing for a decade. And it's not easy to do that. It's not easy to create a form of a shared life together in Christ that does not succumb to the corporate predatorial tactics. And we could say other things that you're talking about. And I have so much respect for people who are still doing that, because it's hard. It's just really hard it's not an easy thing. And then also, John, when I look at you, I think that's for me pastorally, where I'm also and everybody's journey is different. For a person who's I'm not in church, I'm probably not going to end up in a local church, but I'm still on this intentional path. I'm and that's also makes sense to me. And I get it. And I, those people need to be guided and cared for as well. And I think that's kind of where I'm at. It's for me, they're both okay. And I think for leaders, and we talked about this earlier, it's like, John, when you were talking about, the different paths people were on, it's like, why is it so hard to just let people be? That's a question I have for people sometimes. Like, that person's journey is never going to look anything like yours, and it doesn't have to. And even for me with Imagine over the years, it's like, what does it mean for us to be present with them as possible, where they are, as they are? And if they're interested, perhaps we'll help be a part of guiding them to the next couple steps in their life. And whatever that is for them towards growth, which is going to look different from this other person, that's also valuable. Like, there's been people I can think of a person from Imagine, they were there for years, never became a Christian, never made a decision for Jesus. And I'm like, but their time here was meaningful, and I value whatever my role was in their life, and that's okay. And I think for the future, for people who are staying around to build more hopeful expressions, and other people who are living in post-congregational, post-whatever settings, but still pursuing it, they're both a part of the shared future we all have. You know what I'm saying? Like, as guides absolutely. And as people who are growing. So I'm like, they're both okay. For me, I'm like, they're both okay, and they're both good. And
I agree, but John's also going to hell. So, there is that. So we should at least come to terms with it.
I'm still going to send John an invite to my Easter every year.
Oh, please do. Yeah. Well, if it's in Honolulu, and the second that I can get there, I'd get there just to get back to Hawaii. I've been in Hawaii since 2007. I think is the last time we were there. That was for that little trip to hang out with Wayne.
I haven't been to Hawaii since. Ever? I've never been there.
I've only been there 3 or 4 times. 3 times, 4 times? I don't know. It doesn't matter. My wife and I, as we mentioned when we were offline, we lived there for about a year when we were first married. And so we tripped all around that island for about a year and just had a grand old time, man. And so we do sympathize with you, that you're living.
Well, when I go surf, when I'm in the water surfing in about an hour and a half, I'm gonna think about both of you guys.
Right.
So just know.
Think about John in the rolling hills of Northern California. Think about me in the desert of West Texas. Just wishing there was a soft breeze.
You guys will both be in my heart as my body is in the
water. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and turn you loose to go surfing. Then we're done with you. No, I'm just kidding. We do need to bring it down. But I appreciate you being here. I can't wait to read your books. I'm excited to see those come out. We will link to everything that you have, whether it's online, social media, whatever, into the show notes. So make sure and check out everything Kevin Sweeney. And if you're passing through Honolulu at some point, look him up, say hey. We appreciate, as always, anybody who's willing to come on and just hang out with us and chat with us. We appreciate that.
Yeah,
John,
thank you very much,
words, bud?
I have no parting words, as always.
John, master of the non-parting words. Adios. Sayonara. We'll see you later. Auf Wiedersehen. Yeah? Okay.
There you go.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.